Mr. Gary Oba, as I mentioned, comes to us from the U.S. Consulate General in Guangzhou, China. He previously handled political and military issues in the Office of Japanese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, served as principal officer of the American Consulate in Nagoya, Japan, and served concurrently as Deputy Commissioner General for the U.S. Pavilion at the Aichi World Exposition 2005. Prior to Japan, Oba was chief of the Economic and Travel Services sections of the Kaohsiung branch office at the American Institute in Taiwan. He entered the Foreign Service in 1987 and has served as political, economic, and consular officer at the American Embassy in Guinea-Bissau, West Africa. As a consular officer at the American Consulate in Sapporo, Japan, and as an international affairs officer in the Bureau of Human Rights and Democracy at the Department of State in Washington, D.C. Prior to entering the Foreign Service, he worked as a city manager and city attorney in St. Mary's, Alaska, and as a member of the Alaska Bar Association. Born and raised in Colorado, he received a BA in Asian Studies and Political Science, an MPA, and a law degree from BYU Provo. Oba and his wife, Kaoru Yamamoto, who's an intercultural communications consultant, are the parents of 2 children, one of whom I know, Alisa, who works for us here in the Kennedy Center and our Advisement Center, and a son, Ken. As I mentioned before, he will be speaking on The World is Flat, Lessons from China's Migrant Workers. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Gary Oba.
It's a pleasure to be with you today. I've been especially happy to be in the United States this time around. Our last year in Guangzhou, we've discovered that it's a rare opportunity to see the sun. And there's so much industry that the pollution is so thick that we go for weeks at a time without seeing the sun. So I'm here to clear out my lungs and to see if I can breathe some fresh mountain air. I have been, though, in Colorado for a couple of weeks where my home base is. And during that period of time, I haven't been wearing a necktie, so I'm feeling like I'm starting to get out of practice for the true role of a diplomat. Because no matter how hot it is in Guangzhou, we still wear a necktie. During the Christmas break, my daughter, who's here with us today, came home, and during that time, since I'm the Sunday school president in the small branch that we have in Guangzhou, I convinced her to substitute in our Sunday school program. She was a little bit nervous about it. She prepared very well, did a great job. But I can't help but think that her whispering into her boss's ear that her dad was coming through Provo and maybe that would be a good speaking opportunity isn't a little form of revenge. So I will learn my lesson there. Even though I've received permission from the Department of State to speak with you on this subject today, I would have you understand that my presentation today are my personal views and not expressions of any kind of official policy. This is especially true since I knew my daughter was going to be here. I put a lot of stuff in here that will come across as you will understand, like a father speaking to their daughter. So I hope you'll understand and forgive that. Before I launch into my topic of today, I thought it might be useful to give a little bit of an explanation regarding the nature of my work. My formal job title at the consulate is Transformational Diplomacy. And I'm going to see if I can do this here. I'm the Transformational Diplomacy Officer. Now, that's a kind of highfalutin sounding title, and you may be a little bit confused as to what it means. So I'll try to explain it. One of the signature initiatives of former Secretary of State Rice was a program called Transformational Diplomacy. And basically what this was, and it was an effort to take some of the positions that we have, the reporting officer positions in our large and well-established consulates and embassies, and move those to locations and cities where we currently have no diplomatic presence. The idea was to create one-person or two-person diplomatic outposts. And the point of all of this was to try to spread the ability, expand the ability of the United States to project and influence opinions and attitudes in areas throughout the world where we're currently not based. Just as the Secretary and the Department initiated the process of trying to do this reallocation of positions, they encountered a couple of major hurdles. One of them was this new concept of one-person diplomatic posts. did not fit within the existing classifications under the Vienna Convention, which currently governs the establishment of diplomatic posts. A lot of countries are pretty much locked into embassies, consulates, and these one-person posts didn't fit into that concept very well. The other problem that the department ran into was, as they went through the calculations, finance-wise, they discovered that it would be very, very costly to provide the kind of security protection that the department typically provides for consulates and embassies overseas for these one-person posts. So they put a hold on the program on that account as well. In the meantime, there were officers like myself who bid on these assignments, were selected, and were assigned, and then found out that we weren't going to be able to do those jobs because the program was on hold. I was originally assigned as the American Presence Officer in Xiamen, China. Xiamen, as you may know, is a coastal city in southern China. Many years ago, it was called Amoy, and 160 years ago, we had a U.S. consulate in Amoy. And I was looking forward to the opportunity to reopen Xiamen as the U.S. representative there. But since that wasn't to be, I've been assigned to the Consulate General in Guangzhou. And out of Guangzhou, I travel frequently to Xiamen and Fujian, other cities in Fujian. And we try to do, through that travel, much of what we would be doing if we were actually living in Xiamen. Transformational diplomacy is really a fancy word for outreach diplomacy. What we want to do is transform the attitudes and opinions of people in areas where we don't have the U.S. presence. But in order to do this, we're trying to transform as well the way that we go about doing our business. Our goal is to create the closer ties with the population centers. And as you may know, China has a number of population centers, more than four dozen or so cities that have more than 2 million population. And so there are a lot of big cities out there where we don't have a U.S. presence. Now, this is a Department of State initiative, so to be true to that, we've created new acronyms. Chances are you probably haven't heard of these, but we've got APP and we've got VPP. APP stands for American Presence Post, and I was going to be an American Presence Post officer in Xiamen. VPP stands for Virtual Presence Post, and where we've not been able to establish an actual presence, we've established a virtual presence, which entails the use of the internet to create a website for a given city, and then visits by teams of officers from our consulate to do what we would do in that city if we were established there, and then we document that on the web so that we can show the connection that we're trying to build. The yellow buttons here show where we have existing VPP posts around the world, and the blue gives you an idea of where we're hoping to establish them in the future. You can see we've got a lot of blue dots there in China because there are so many cities that don't have a presence there. The objectives of this program are not too hard to explain, and I'll go through these quickly. One is to engage key audiences, including officials, students, the media, academia, NGOs, and others, to explain U.S. policies and to foster stronger bilateral relations. Another is to deploy these virtual presence post teams to help strengthen the ties through on-the-ground activities. We utilize the VPP websites to highlight those ties to the U.S. and provide a link to the official information about the United States. Together with the consulate's public affairs program section, we develop and we carry out diplomatic programs, public diplomacy programs in these areas. In conjunction with the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service and the agricultural trade offices, we do what we can in these areas to support U.S. commercial interests and business interests. I might mention just on the side, in Xiamen we have a number of U.S. commercial business interests. Dell Computers has a large facility in Xiamen. And we support high-level U.S. visitors to these areas. I've already had several congressional-level delegations that have come through Xiamen, and I hope to, within the next year, have the opportunity to support the first visit to Xiamen of our to-be ambassador to China, Ambassador Huntsman. I want to provide just a few pictures so you can kind of visualize what some of this work looks like. The first picture here shows our meeting with the mayor of Xiamen, and in the second meeting, a meeting we had with prosecutors at the intermediate court in Xiamen. This picture shows some of the speaking programs that we've offered through our public affairs program in some of the universities in the area. This shows some of our meetings with the businesses that are established in the area, including the U.S. businesses and some of the local businesses as well. And this shows our outreach to some of the non-governmental groups and organizations that have been established. We consider this outreach especially important because as China goes through the process of constructing a civil society, these are the groups often that are leading the way in that effort. We have established these websites. This website is the website we have for our shaman operation. And on the website, the information that most people want is the information about visas, how you get a visa to go to the United States. But we also take advantage of the website to provide pictures and a short description of our activities in shaman. And I also write a monthly blog that goes into the website as well that shares a few thoughts. These websites provide a very public window on the kind of diplomacy that we're conducting in China. As for the future of transformational diplomacy, we have a new president, we have a new Secretary of State, and while it's entirely possible that the nomenclature will change from transformational diplomacy to something else, the nature of the work that we're doing, my program's going too fast here. All right. It's entirely possible that we won't be called transformational diplomacy officers, but it's likely that we'll be doing the same kind of work under some kind of name, especially in countries like China where there are so many people that we haven't really reached with our outreach efforts. Okay, with that, I'll move on to my subject of today, which I've called The World is Flat, Lessons from China's Migrant Workers. The last year that I've spent in China has left a very, very deep impression, and that impression is fundamentally that the world is changing in very, very big ways. These observations are based on being on the ground, having up-close contact with a number of folks and individuals, groups in southern China, and have left me with the impression that globalization is changing the way the world works. Now, you've probably been introduced to this concept through the work of Mr. Friedman in his book, The World is Flat. I know that some people, when they've heard Freeman's mantra that the world is flat, have dismissed it, saying that it's like Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. I think, though, that he's actually onto something very, very important. I've encouraged my daughter to read the book. He notes that China, India, and other developing countries have become part of the global economy, and this is fundamentally changing the distribution of jobs and wealth in the world. Freeman quotes a 2004 study by Harvard University economist Richard Freeman to show that from 1985 to the year 2000, the global economic world expanded to include the former Soviet Union, China, and India. And this added an estimated 1.5 billion new workers to the global economic labor force. He notes as well that if even only 10% of these workers have the education and tools to allow them to compete in a meaningful way, that's still 150 million people, roughly the size of the entire U.S. workforce. He notes, and I think this is important, that a lot of these new workers are not just walking onto the playing field. They're jogging and they're sprinting there. And he concludes, the winners will be those who learn the habits, the processes, the skills most quickly. And there's nothing that guarantees that Americans or Western Europeans will permanently lead the way. This is a brave new economic world, and it's far different from the world that existed at the time that I graduated from BYU in 1984. At that time, just 12 years after Richard Nixon visited China and China began its reopening to the world, the strongest impressions of China were of its crushing poverty and the relatively low level of development. The streets were filled with bicycles and there were very few cars. Most people wore kind of uniform, plain, ill-fitting clothing. Consumer products made in China at the time were generally of very low quality. Public spaces that attracted crowds were generally very littered, and there were very... I'm having problems here, but... all right, sorry. There were very few public restrooms, and those that exist did exist were not pleasant places. The press of the crowds at train stations and bus stops could be overwhelming for the uninitiated. And for the most part, public spaces, including China's rich historical landmarks, they appeared run down and tired. I remember in 1985, on my way out of China, after visiting on my own, I booked passage in a first-class cabin on a boat from Shanghai to Hong Kong, and I remember having to pick the bugs out of my rice that was served on the boat. I remember being very happy to get to Hong Kong, where I could munch down under the golden arches. Now, compare this with the China of 2008, especially the China that the world witnessed at the 2008 Olympics. You've got world-class architecture in the new in the venues that were developed for the games. There are broad thoroughfares, impressive transportation systems, ultra-modern airport terminals, first-class restaurants and hotels. And city residents who dress in dress and behavior were not all that different from the people in the rest of the developed world. This is a China now that has a Kentucky Fried Chicken or a McDonald's on almost every street corner. And for those that have more refined tastes, there are restaurants that serve every type of international cuisine. Upscale shopping areas are full of luxury brand shops and other shopping streets that showcase endless varieties of goods. And although brand names are sometimes different, the make and quality of a lot of consumer goods is not that perceptibly different than what you'd find in the West. There's so many cars in Beijing now that in order to clean up the air for the Olympics, authorities use the odd and even numbers of the license plates. Sorry, you're getting a preview of things here, but I don't know why it's got a mind of its own here. Maybe I will... No, I've gone too far. Can we set it so that I can just click it here? Okay. Anyway, the authorities set up the system so that odd number, even the cars' license plates were used to keep half the cars off the roads on alternating dates. Yes, there still are a lot of crowds in China, especially in public places. But these are crowds now that are at least publicly admonished to exhibit civil behavior. And in China, that means learning to wait in line and to avoid spitting in public. Economically, during the last 25 years, China has undergone an amazing transformation. China's cityscapes are populated with construction cranes, express highways span the country. Many localities have developed large-scale or huge transportation infrastructure projects. There are many cities that have new airports, huge new airports, which offer an expanding variety of local and international connections. Even as the world has slumped into a recession, China's GDP continues to record positive growth, albeit they're down to a single-digit growth from double-digit growth. This growth has been made possible as China has become the factory for the world. Items of almost every type and variety are now manufactured and exported from China. And to help provide a sense of both the scale and the scope of this, I want to describe a recent visit I made to the Canton Fair. So if I can get there. Okay. I don't know, have any of you heard of the Canton Fair? Okay. To tell the truth, before I went to Guangzhou, I hadn't. But twice a year in Guangzhou hosts this fair. Thousands of would-be sellers from everywhere across China and thousands of buyers from all across the world converge in what must be one of the world's largest market and trade spectacles. Literally, thousands of vendor booths hawk almost every imaginable product, and I might add a few unimaginable ones as well. Purpose-built exhibition halls that cover over 100 football fields worth of space provide space for these booths. And they're so large that you have to target the products that you're interested in examining, or you'll just drop from exhaustion from trying to cover the fair. If you've ever wondered where the retail outlets that provide us with most of our consumer goods do their shopping, well, it's at fairs like this. And this is one of the largest ones in the world. The buyers that come to these fairs are not buying in small quantities. As I was touring the fair, I came across some Christmas decorations. There are floors and floors of Christmas decorations, since they're mostly made in China. But I came across some decorative deer covered with natural bark that I thought, well, that would look pretty neat at home. So I went and I asked the seller, what's your minimum order? Well, the minimum order for these decorative deer items that no one could want too many of was a 20-foot container. I didn't quite want that many. Now, to provide some sense of the scale and the scope of the economy in just southern China, where I'm currently stationed, our consular district in Guangzhou contains Guangdong, Fujian, Guangxi, and Hainan provinces. This area, these 4 provinces in southern China, have almost 200 million residents. If they were a country by themselves, they would have the 15th largest economy in the world. Now that's equivalent to Russia and France combined, with a combined GDP of $806 billion. Guangdong itself is the richest province in China and is single-handedly responsible for producing about 1/9 of China's total GDP. Now, who drives this kind of economic output? Certainly in the case of southern China, but also for other major manufacturing centers across China, a significant contribution is made by migrant workers. Estimates of the total number of migrant workers in China range from 150 to 220 million. These are mostly young workers who come from rural backgrounds in poor provinces in China's interior. In search of a better life and economic opportunities, they've migrated to the larger cities, generally along coastal areas, where they work in the factories, the emerging services industries, and in construction projects. As a group, they constitute the single largest internal migration within a country anywhere in the world. To visualize the scope of this migration, I want to describe to you the conditions at the Guangzhou train station in February of 2008 during the Chinese Lunar New Year's festival holiday. At that time, due to the harsh winter conditions that blocked a number of railroad routes, there were 500,000 people stranded at this train station. Imagine, if you will, and I figure this is about 8 Lavelle Edwards stadiums worth of people. If you've ever thought that traffic was bad here in Provo on a game day, imagine the congestion, the sanitation, and the crowd control challenges that the Guangzhou authorities faced. Many, if not most, of these people stranded at the station in Guangzhou were migrant workers who were headed home to points in China's interior to spend what is often their only annual holiday period, the Lunar Chinese New Year's festival. Beginning in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, when central authorities loosened controls on movement in connection with the opening of China's economy, increasing numbers of individuals left farms and rural communities. They were attracted by the bright lights and the economic opportunities available in the coastal areas. Although many of these individuals have only received up through a junior high school education in poor rural schools, they are often the best and the brightest coming from their villages. Once these individuals have found work, they typically work hard and long for minimal wages. Pay and benefits vary, but they generally fall within the $120 to $300 a month range. Recent changes in the labor law have provided improved protection for migrant workers, but often unable to register their residency due to laws that keep their household registration in the villages from which they came. Migrant workers are often denied access to education and other social services benefits. They generally live in extremely modest conditions, shared quarters with a number of other migrant workers. As a group, though, they have sent the equivalent of billions of dollars back to their families in the rural areas. Across China, in many rural areas, you can see physical monuments to their dedication, modern homes that have been built, funded by these remittances. At the same time, their labor is responsible, according to estimates from UNESCO and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, for more than 15% of the growth in China's gross domestic product. A recent CNN report on the migrant workers noted that today's migrant workers dominate the Chinese labor force in dirty and dangerous trades. 70% of the construction workers are migrant workers, 68% of manufacturing employees are migrant workers, and 80% of the coal miners are migrant workers. But not all of them are on their hands and knees. more than 60% of the staff in the service trade as well is also migrant workers. The current global economic turndown has impacted the lives of many of these migrant workers, as factory orders have dropped and some companies have gone out of business and others have scaled back production. An estimated 20 million migrant workers have lost their jobs. Work for those that remain, hours have been reduced and wages have been decreased as well, as employers have tried to take advantage of the excess in labor available. But even under these conditions, only a few migrant workers seem inclined to return to their villages. In an article entitled An Army Marching to Escape Medieval China in the Financial Times on April 20th, the author describes some of the reasons that these migrant workers are reluctant to return home. But basically it's very simple. Once they've escaped the quote-unquote medieval conditions of rural China, they're loath to return. They see their futures as being in the larger cities and coastal regions where they found employment. In the past year, and at the invitation of an NGO working to provide educational opportunities for migrant workers in Xiamen, I've had the opportunity to meet a couple of times with groups that range between 15 and 30 migrant workers at this NGO's facility. This facility is located in a section of Xiamen where there are an estimated 60,000 migrant workers. Most of these migrant workers fit the national profile. They are young men and women in their 20s who have left their rural roots to come to Xiamen in search of employment. Many have accepted jobs that pay as little as $150 a month and for which they're expected to work between 8 and 12 hours a day, often 6 days a week. Given the rudimentary levels of education available in rural areas, I was surprised to encounter the well-informed and openly inquisitive groups that I did. These were genuinely impressive groups of young people who were clearly motivated and ambitious. Notwithstanding China's controlled media, they displayed a good grasp of current issues, including politics and politicians in the United States. I wondered at the time, for example, how many of their peers in the United States could name the president of the PRC. During one of our meetings, the main topic of conversation was education. They were particularly interested in the subject of community college education, and they hoped that such opportunities would become increasingly available to people in China. I couldn't help but think of Thomas Friedman's observation that in this new flat world, there will be a lot of people out there trying to get smarter. And if these groups of migrant workers are any indication, it's clear that there are many such motivated individuals in China. Despite the handicaps and genuine hardships imposed by a still highly inefficient system that fails to distribute opportunities fairly, these people reflected a tremendous sense of vitality and energy. Deng Xiaoping, the author of China's Economic Opening Up, is quoted by some as having said, "Poverty is not socialism. To be rich is glorious." Millions of Chinese migrant workers have been inspired by this version of the Chinese dream, and they are actively seeking to improve their lot in life. Among the lessons that we can draw from their lives and examples, I've identified 6 that I'd like to discuss with you briefly today. They include the following: the need to be hungry, focused and determined, the need to work hard and sacrifice, the need to delay gratification and eliminate senses of entitlement, the need to save even when it hurts and to avoid debt, the need to seek self-improvement, to be literate, curious, informed about the world, and the need to understand that there's very little direct correlation between wealth and happiness. Starting with the first, and now that you've heard my listing there, you'll see that this is Dad speaking to his daughter. So forgive me for this part of this. You've got to be hungry, focused, and determined. And you've got to turn off the TV. If asked for adjectives to describe migrant workers who I met, I'd probably choose words like lean, tough, and smart. A far cry from the soft and fat that might describe me or many of us in America. Most migrant workers have overcome significant obstacles in order to attain even minimal levels of education, leave their villages, and travel to distant areas in order to seek employment. They've had to use ingenuity and a good deal of natural intelligence to beat the odds. They are survivors in the true sense of the word. Their reality is harsh and unforgiving, and they are competing, literally, with millions of others. To succeed, they've had to be hungry, focused, and determined in achieving their goals. The migrant workers that I've met are probably the antithesis of couch potatoes. There is little, if any, time for TV in their lives. In this regard, China's national broadcasters probably deserve some credit for offering such unappealing choices. But contrast this, if you will, to TV viewing in America. It's said that the average American watches 4 hours of TV a day. Now, if you calculate that out, that's 2 months of TV a year. We're focused, all right, but it seems we're focused on American Idol, the latest pro football game, Desperate Housewives, or Prison Break. Researchers say our TV focus also drives some unhealthy appetites. TV watching related to inactivity is related to inactivity, and the subliminal effects of food advertising are said to contribute to obesity. According to TV Free America, the average child will watch 8,000 murders before he finishes elementary school. The American Psychiatric Association, endorsing National TV Turn-Off Week, said, "We have a long-standing concern about the impact of television behavior, especially on children." So while we're focused in the United States on TV and hungry, at least for fast food, we're apparently not focused in the same way that these migrant workers are focused on achieving goals, succeeding, and getting ahead. Just think what we could do as a nation if we would convert our TV time into time spent on developing new skills, abilities, and knowledge. Second, you've got to work hard and you've got to sacrifice. One of the young men that I met in Xiamen related to me that he was born in a rural village where his parents, who were farmers, worked the land from sunup to dark simply to survive, and found that it was practically impossible to save the few extra dollars that would be required to allow him to get an education. They did, however, make that sacrifice. So mindful of his parents' work and sacrifice, he described his own dedication and motivation to work hard and do the best he could in his studies. He was always remembering the efforts of his parents, and he felt that the only way that he could repay their sacrifice was through establishing himself and making some success. I think this young man's attitude is representative of the attitudes of many of the migrant workers in China today. They are willing to work long and hard hours at considerable personal sacrifice in order to help themselves and their families escape the grinding poverty that's common in rural China. As I mentioned before, it's not unusual for some of these folks to work 10 or more hours a day, 6 days a week. Now, I don't condone the abusive labor practices that their employers are carrying out, but I do want to commend to you the value of hard work and sacrifice. If you'll reflect on the achievements of which you're most proud in your life, I'd guess that you'll find a fairly close correlation between achievements and some hard work and sacrifice. Certainly, those of us that enjoy the legacy of the Mormon pioneers, especially those such as the handcart pioneers, can ask ourselves, are we remembering their efforts and their sacrifices like the migrant workers of today, mindful of these sacrifices and determined to demonstrate our gratitude through our own hard work and sacrifice? Number 3 is learning to delay gratification and then eliminate a sense of entitlement. The young migrant workers that I've met have no illusions that the world owes them anything. They understand that their success depends entirely on their own efforts. They also understand that in order to achieve their longer-term objectives, such as building a house for their families, they must delay or deny gratification of many personal desires. Even as conspicuous consumption grows in China, these workers continue to live exceptionally modestly, acquiring few material goods. Now, as I was in Colorado enjoying a few days of leave, I read in the Denver Post a column that was done by I think it was the Dallas News columnist, and he was writing as a counterpoint to the kind of lofty graduation rhetoric that we hear this time of year. But his message for high school graduates today was this: you can't have it all. And to this I might add, you can't have it all, and you can't have it all now. Many of us were raised in periods of unprecedented prosperity, And accustomed to material comforts, many of us have more or less assumed that we are entitled to similar levels of material comfort or well-being as our parents were, even as we start off and strike off on our own to begin our own families. To those of you who are struggling students who are forced to forgo spending on some things and forced to forgo some of those material comforts in order to make ends meet, I hope you understand how fortunate you are. The lessons that you're learning through this process as you learn to postpone purchases and delay gratification will serve you well in life. You may have heard of some of the studies on delayed gratification that were carried out on groups of children who were offered the choice of a tempting treat that they could have immediately or the promise of a better reward if they would wait for a little. Concerning these studies, I read the comments by one online blogger who said, "Those who preferred instant gratification take a path that leads them to shoot for easier goals, spend more, save less, and make more impulsive decisions. Those who defer gratification are likely to sacrifice short-term pleasures to shoot for more long-term, challenging goals. For example, they may decide to defer social life to take more challenging courses in school. They may decide to pay their way through school by working rather than borrowing, or they may spend a little extra time in college to get that graduate degree. And they are more likely to inculcate the same habits in their children. With delayed gratification, we learn to become smart savers and judicious spenders. On the other hand, as the current economic recession shows in no small measure, greed and an addiction to instant gratification can lead to recession and sometimes worse. It seems that too many of us wanted homes right now that were too big and beyond our ability to afford. So there's something to be said for learning to delay gratification. In his column, the columnist, his name was Rod Dreher, he also observed, people wonder how to get what they want, but they rarely think about what they should want. This strikes me as particularly useful food for thought. How often do we move beyond thinking about what we want to wondering about what we should want? In his stern rebuke to those that he accused of having stiff necks and high heads, the prophet Jacob taught that riches, if they were to be sought at all, were to be sought with the intent to do good, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to liberate the captive, and to administer relief to the sick and afflicted. A couple weeks ago in China, I had the privilege of meeting a young American couple who have clearly done some serious thinking about the kinds of things that are important, the kinds of things that maybe we should really want. Motivated by a strong desire to help orphan children in China, and especially orphan children with special needs. And these are precisely the type of children in China who are the most neglected. This couple jettisoned their careers. They sold their home, and they moved their family to Fuzhou, China. In the space of a few short years, the number of special needs children in their care has increased to 25. Their efforts have attracted the volunteer services of trained professionals from overseas who have outlined individual therapy regimens for each of their children. And their efforts have also attracted the services of dedicated volunteers who ensure that each of these children receive ample doses of attention and affection. In describing the goals of the facility, the wife noted that she wanted nothing less for each of the children in their care than what she would hope to provide for her own children. I left this encounter convinced that there really are some people who make a very, very big difference in the world and that are focused on the things that really matter. Number 4 is learning to save even when it hurts and avoid debt. As I noted earlier, China's migrant workers, despite their low wages, have managed to send billions of dollars back to their families in remittances. Imagine, though, if you were a migrant worker and your monthly pay were $150. If you're like the others, you'd spend about half on rent, food, other necessities, and maybe on your only luxury, a cell phone. The majority of what's left would have to go into savings if you're going to save anything. Notice what's missing here. Any significant spending on recreation, on entertainment, on travel, on a car, on credit cards. Economists have estimated the savings rate in China, that is the percent of a savings in a person's disposable income, has averaged around 30%. Compare this to a U.S. savings rate that's dipped recently into negative territory. In October 2008, the CBS Evening News reported that the average American has 9 credit cards and owes more than $16,000, not including mortgages. The report noted that during the current decade, real wages for Americans have increased 4%, while credit card debt has jumped more than 75%. These are really pretty staggering numbers, but a relatively simple question remains. If a migrant worker can save almost half of his or her income, what's our excuse for not being able to save anything? Number 5 is continually seek self-improvement, be literate, curious, informed about the wider world. Many of the migrant workers with whom I met do some mind-numbingly dull, repetitive assembly work at a factory. I don't doubt that by the end of the day they're really tired, and chances are they really would just like to rest. But the ones I met were in an evening class, a class that started around 7 and would go for a couple of hours. In order to improve their skills, increase their knowledge, and expand their vision, they were opting to attend these night classes at a community center. Now, of course, not all migrant workers are attending night classes. Some do simply want to rest. But there are the dedicated few, like those that I've met, who exemplify the strong commitment to self-improvement. And there are many others who will at least take the time to take a publicly posted copy, read a posted copy of the daily newspaper so that they know what's going on in the world around them. In his book, Friedman suggests that one way of surviving the new flat world is to continually upgrade our skills so we can do higher value-added jobs. And I know that many professions in the United States are already requiring continuing education type training. I think this type of training will become more and more important. And I think the reality for all of us is that we've got to view things like college as training on how to learn rather than as being the capstone experience of learning everything we'll ever need to know. The migrant workers that I've met in Xiamen understand that by constantly upgrading their skills, it's their ticket to improving their lives. An important but less formal component of learning is staying informed about the world around us. In my exchanges with the migrant workers in Xiamen, I came away impressed with their understanding of current events. When the U.S. presidential election was underway, they asked informed questions about the candidates and their policies. They also asked informed questions about global warming, religious freedom, education in America, healthcare, racial relations, women in the workforce, trade barriers, the global economy, and the dangers of eating too much fast food. Now, mind you, these probing questions were fielded by a group of workers that we would classify as relatively disadvantaged blue-collar workers. The last thing is understanding that there's little direct correlation between wealth and happiness. A Harris poll released in May this year reported that despite the economic recession in the U.S., many Americans continue to be quite happy. The report noted that happiness is not simply related to jobs or even economic stability, but it rather is more related to having a close network of friends and positive relationships with family members. It's also having spiritual beliefs that are important to people. During my assignments overseas, I've lived in some of the poorest and the richest nations. In one of the poorest countries in Africa and now in China, we have found that many people find happiness and strength in their family and friendships. We've also observed that many people in these poor countries are exceptionally generous and willing to share. When we were posted in West Africa many, many years ago, we had the Peace Corps come into the country during the time that we were there. And on one occasion, one of the Peace Corps volunteers got lost. He was going through the countryside, didn't know where he was. A family invited him in and served him a dinner. The dinner included a chicken. Little did he know at the time, but he did understand later, that they were probably in the kind of economic condition that they would have chicken once a year. And they had killed that chicken to provide a dinner for their guest who was visiting. Despite the considerable challenges that they face, the migrant workers that I know strike me as, for the most part, very happy people. And that happiness that's reflected in their countenances demonstrates that they certainly understand the futility of thinking that happiness has to be postponed until a certain economic status or certain goals are achieved. Rather, they seem to understand that today's burdens are more easily shouldered if you have a happy heart. I think we sometimes fall into a trap in which we say, to ourselves, or we impose conditions on our ability to feel happy. Perhaps we say, I'll be happy when I finish this test. I'll be happy when I graduate and get a job. I'll be happy when I find the right one and get married. Or if we're driving somewhere, and especially if we're late, we may say, I'll be happy when I get there. Our challenge is to understand, as one author has noted, that we're not late until we get there. We're not late until we get there. Or in other words, we have every reason to relax and enjoy the journey, not just the destination. We have every reason to learn to be happy in the state that we're in now. This is really my hope for you, that you can be happy in your journey, that you can be hungry, focused, and determined, that you can work hard and sacrifice, that you can learn to delay gratification and eliminate a sense of entitlement, that you can learn to save, even when it hurts, and avoid debt, and that you'll continually seek self-improvement so that you can be literate, curious, and informed about the wider world. These are some of the important lessons that we can learn, I believe, from China's migrant workers, and lessons that will be of critical importance to us in surviving and thriving in the new world global economy. Thank you for your attention today.